problem that China has strategically is that it's hostage to its consumer countries. Its ability to buy from other countries, from Australia, for example, depends on the propensity of other countries to buy from it. It's an exporting nation. Yes, it has a domestic economy, but relative to the size of its industrial plant, it's very small. So, as you point out, who gets hurt more in an American economic downturn? The Chinese problem is they have so little room for maneuver economically. They have a very large population, several hundred million, making relatively little money in the Chinese industrial plant. If they're laid off, if they become unemployed, this becomes a very dangerous situation.
Can I jump in here? Because aren't these two countries, these two powers, really rather dependent on each other? Because, as you said, the Chinese need the American imports, but America needs China too. So why don't they just get along? Or is that
Well, that's
too
what they're
fanciful?
trying to do. This is what makes this the most interesting power rivalry that we've had in decades, in centuries. It's not like the U.S.-Soviet rivalry, because the U.S. and the Soviets had relatively nothing to do with each other economically. These are two powers that need to get along with each other, that need to support each other's economies, and yet have different interests geographically in the Western Pacific.
One of the interesting things in the past 2 years has been the decoupling of American consumption from China. The resourcing to places like Mexico, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and so on. As the cost of Chinese products have risen, and they've risen substantially, the structural shifts that are slowly taking place in the American economy have mattered. The point is the United States has options in where it buys. China has less options in where it sells. So this doesn't mean that China is going to collapse, disappear, black hole. I mean, these are childish things. But what it does mean is that the tension between the two countries will actually grow, particularly because China is so uneasy about the United States.
Building on what George said, let me point to the map here. You have what's here the Chinese call the first island chain in the Pacific. Japan, South Korea, the half island of South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, the Indonesian archipelago, Australia. These are all U.S. allies. So when Chinese Navy planners look outward, they see a Great Wall in reverse, kind of a chain of allies. And a lot has been made of the Taiwan problem. And the Taiwan problem is often discussed in the media through moral terms. You know, we defend Taiwan as a democracy. China wants to regain Taiwan to restore its national patrimony. But there's an amoral strategic angle to this, which is that, as Douglas MacArthur said, or I think it was MacArthur, called Taiwan the unsinkable aircraft carrier out at the northern end of the South China Sea. Right here. If China were able to envelop Taiwan, to make an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty by trading with Taiwan to the degree that it is, I mean, there are 270 commercial flights a week between the mainland and Taiwan.
Taiwanese are quite happy with things as they are.
Yeah, and intimidating Taiwan at the same time militarily, China will thus be able to break out of this island chain and direct its strategic energies elsewhere.
That's an interesting question, because the only way that China can break out of this is through political military means, economic means. The question is, if you're Taiwanese, I mean, you love your trade relationship with China. It's greatly beneficial to you. At the same time, you don't trust the communist regime, and you don't trust what would happen if your autonomy were subsumed to it. You can't assume that your well-being would be protected. China's ultimate strategy is not a naval one. It goes back to what the Soviets did. It is arming, supporting groups in places like Aceh, in various places in Indonesia, to create instability in those countries, to create openings in the waterways, for example, with the use of profusion of anti-ship technologies. Imagine that a guerrilla group could close this off. So I would agree that I'm not worried about the Chinese Navy. I am worried about the Chinese sense of embattlement, and that out of that sense of embattlement, maybe Taiwan, Bob may be right that Taiwan does it, I doubt, but it is this whole area that it could potentially destabilize. And so it's a national security which is heavily dependent on the import of raw materials and the export of finished products is dependent in a complex number of ways on the United States. The United States' willingness to buy, the price that China can sell, the willingness of the United States to permit the movement of goods. All of these things, when China looks at the world, it sees vulnerability. It sees all the ways
that's
in which
true.
it's at risk.
Yeah.
And that's an asymmetric relationship, I think, between the U.S. and China.